Monday, the 10th of August 2020. I'm Fiammetta Rocco, Senior Editor at The Economist. Welcome to Editor's Picks, where you can hear 3 highlights from the paper this week. They're read aloud, so you can listen wherever you are. Our cover story looks at universities in the age of COVID-19. Many students must choose between seminars streamed into their parents' living rooms or deferring their studies until life is more normal. Universities will lose revenue from foreign students and will have to transform the way they operate to avoid contagion on campus. This presents an opportunity for long-needed change. Next, Beirut, a city in ruins. The massive explosion caused by spectacular negligence shatters a place that was already reeling under an inept and corrupt government. And finally, why has TV from China's Hunan province become so popular? The stories you're about to hear are just a sample of what's on offer in the paper this week. With a subscription, you can read or listen to all of what we do. For your best introductory offer, go to economist.com/podcast offer. The link is in the show notes. First up, the absent student.
In the normal run of things, late summer sees airports in the emerging world fill with nervous 18-year-olds jetting off to begin a new life in the rich world's universities. The annual trek of more than 5 million students is a triumph of globalization. Students see the world, universities get a fresh batch of high-paying customers. Yet, with flights grounded and borders closed, this migration is about to become the pandemic's latest victim. For students, COVID-19 is making life difficult. Many must choose between inconveniently timed seminars streamed into their parents' living rooms and inconveniently deferring their studies until life is more normal. For universities, it is disastrous. They will not only lose huge chunks of revenue from foreign students, but because campus life spreads infection, they will have to transform the way they operate. Yet the disaster may have an upside. For many years, government subsidies and booming demand have allowed universities to resist changes that could benefit both students and society. They may not be able to do so for much longer. Higher education has been thriving. Since 1995, as the notion spread from the rich world to the emerging one that a degree from a good institution was essential, the number of young people enrolling in higher education rose from 16% of the relevant age group to 38%. The results have been visible on swanky campuses throughout the Anglosphere, whose better universities have been the principal beneficiaries of the emerging world's aspirations. Yet troubles are piling up. China has been a source of high-paying foreign students for Western universities, but relations between the West and China are souring. Students with ties to the army are to be banned from America. Governments have been turning against universities too. In an age when politics divides along educational lines, universities struggle to persuade some politicians of their merit. President Donald Trump attacks them for radical left indoctrination, not education. Some 59% of Republican voters have a negative view of colleges. Just 18% of Democrats do. In Britain, universities' noisy opposition to Brexit has not helped. Given that the state pays for between 1/4 and 1/2 of tertiary education in America, Australia and Britain through student loans and grants, the government's enthusiasm matters. Skepticism among politicians is not born only of spite. Governments invest in higher education to boost productivity by increasing human capital. But even as universities have boomed, productivity growth in the rich country economies has fallen. Many politicians suspect that universities are not teaching the right subjects and are producing more graduates than labour markets need. Small wonder that the state is beginning to pull back. In America, government spending on universities has been flat in recent years. In Australia, even as the price of humanities degrees doubles, so it will fall for subjects the government deems good for growth. There are questions about the benefits to students too. The graduate premium is healthy enough on average for a degree to be financially worthwhile, but not for everybody. In Britain, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, or IFS, has calculated that a fifth of graduates would be better off if they had never gone to university. In America, 4 in 10 students still do not graduate 6 years after starting their degree, and for those who do, the wage premium is shrinking. Across the world as a whole, student enrollment continues to grow, but in America it declined by 8% in 2010 to 18. Then came COVID-19. Although recessions tend to boost demand for higher education, as poor job prospects spur people to seek qualifications, revenues may nevertheless fall. Government rules will combine with student nerves to keep numbers down. Last month, the Trump administration said new foreign students would not be allowed to enter the country if their classes had moved online. Sydney, Melbourne, UNSW and Monash, 4 of Australia's leading universities, rely on foreign students for a third of their income. The IFS expects losses at English universities to amount to over a quarter of 1 year's revenues. The damage from COVID-19 means that, in the short term at least, universities will be more dependent on governments than ever. The IFS reckons that 13 universities in Britain risk going bust. Governments ought to help colleges, but should favour institutions that provide good teaching and research or benefit their community. Those that satisfy none of those criteria should be allowed to go to the wall. Those that survive must learn from the pandemic. Until now, most of them, especially the ones at the top of the market, have resisted putting undergraduate courses online. That is not because remote teaching is necessarily bad. A third of graduate students were studying fully online last year, but because a 3- or 4-year degree on campus was universities' and students' idea of what an undergraduate education should look like. Demand for the services of universities was so intense that they had no need to change. Now change is being forced upon them. The College Crisis Initiative at Davidson College says that less than a quarter of American universities are likely to teach mostly or wholly in person next term. If that persists, it will reduce the demand. Many students buy the university experience not just to boost their earning capacity, but also to get away from their parents, make friends, and find partners. But it should also cut costs by giving students the option of living at home while studying. COVID-19 is catalyzing innovation too. The Big Ten Academic Alliance, a group of Midwestern universities, is offering many of its 600,000 students the opportunity to take online courses at other universities in the group. There is huge scope for using digital technology to improve education. Poor in-person lectures could be replaced by online ones from the best in the world, freeing up time for the small group teaching which students value most. Universities are rightly proud of their centuries-old traditions, but their ancient pedigrees have too often been used as an excuse for resisting change. If COVID-19 shakes them out of their complacency, some good may yet come from this disaster.
Next, a big blast should lead to big change in Lebanon.
The clock had just struck 6 p.m. when the world shook. From Sassine Square, 1 mile, that's 1.6 kilometres from the blast, it seemed like a car bomb or a gas explosion. A disaster, but a localised one. Only on the drive down towards the Mediterranean did the scale of the devastation become clear. Streets were blanketed with broken glass that rained down from battered buildings. At a busy intersection, 3 women sat in the median, holding scraps of fabric to bloodied heads. Beirut was an assault on the senses. The crunch of glass under tyres, the wail of sirens, the acrid smell of smoke. The explosion at Beirut's port on August 4th was gigantic. Residents of Cyprus felt it, 150 miles, that's 240 kilometres away. Seismological monitors in Jordan registered it as the equivalent of a minor earthquake. The shockwave left much of Beirut's city centre in ruins. By the next evening, the death toll was 135, a number that will surely rise as rescuers dig through the rubble. Another 5,000 people were injured. The financial cost will run into billions in a country that can ill afford to pay. The cause seems to be negligence, a mind-boggling degree of it, even by the debased standards of Lebanon's government. In 2013, Lebanon seized a cargo of ammonium nitrate used in fertilizer and in explosives for mining and quarrying from the MV Rosus, a Russian-owned vessel plying the seas from Georgia to Mozambique. The chemicals, all 2,750 tons of them, were stored in a warehouse at the port. The Oklahoma City bombers in 1995 used just 2 tons of the stuff to kill 168 people. Some officials warned of the danger of keeping a giant bomb next to a population centre. Their pleas were ignored. It is still unclear what ignited the stockpile. Local media suggest that workers were welding nearby. Whatever the cause, it sent forth a towering fireball and a shockwave that slammed across half of Beirut. A sickly plume of reddish smoke lingered over the city long into the night. Scientists interviewed on television warned residents to shut their windows and wear masks because of toxic fumes laced with nitric acid. The country's intensive care wards were already near capacity because of a recent spike in COVID-19 cases. None was prepared for the influx of thousands of urgent cases in a single night. At St. George Hospital, a kilometre from the port, the damage was so severe that doctors had to halt surgeries and evacuate the building. 4 nurses were killed by the blast and 15 patients on respirators died when their machines shut down. Other patients, clad in their hospital gowns, some with IV lines still attached to their arms, sat bleeding and stunned in a car park across the street. "It's apocalyptic. There's no other word for it," said a neurosurgeon at the hospital. In a nearby apartment building, the stairs were slick with blood left by residents fleeing their ruined flats. Inside, doors were blown off their hinges, furniture took flight. An estimated 300,000 people, nearly 5% of the country's population, were left homeless by the blast. Some found shelter with family or friends, others had nowhere to go. They swept broken glass off their furniture and bedded down for the night in flats without windows or doors or electricity. The city looked no better the next morning. Workers with brooms swept up glass until it overflowed dumpsters and piled in heaps on the curb. Pedestrians looked up nervously as they walked, lest falling debris land on their heads. Repairing the damage would be a tall order in good times. These are not good times in Lebanon. The economy has all but collapsed since October. Its currency, the pound, had been pegged for decades at 1,500 to the dollar. But the country has run short of dollars to maintain the peg and finance its yawning trade deficit. It can no longer sustain a years-long Ponzi scheme that saw the central bank, Banque de Liban, or BDL, borrow dollars from commercial banks in exchange for above-market interest payments. The pound now trades at more than 8,000 on the black market, an 80% devaluation from the official rate. The government defaulted on its debts in March for the first time in history. For most Lebanese, life has become a seemingly endless succession of crises. Consumer prices are rising by 90% a year and by 246% for food. A 500-gram jar of Nescafe can cost 10% of the monthly minimum wage. A kilo of beef goes for 15%. The army stopped serving meat to soldiers to cut costs. On June 30th, the government raised bread prices by a third, the first increase in a decade. Half the country now lives below the poverty line, and 3/4 may need aid by year's end. Fuel shortages have led to interminable midsummer blackouts. Power cuts in Beirut, normally 3 hours a day, stretched up to 20 hours in July. Backup generators ran out of diesel or broke down from overuse, leaving many Lebanese in hot, dark apartments. Ojero, the state telecoms monopoly, has warned of internet outages if it cannot power its infrastructure. The main public hospital treating COVID-19 patients had to shut wards and turn off air conditioners because of the blackouts. Petty crime was already on the rise even before the explosion that left thousands of apartments open to intruders. One man held up a pharmacy at gunpoint for nappies. Another robbed a pedestrian, then came back to apologise, saying he needed the cash to feed his family. The government, installed in January, was meant to be a technocratic one that would tackle the economic crisis. It has accomplished almost nothing. After the default, it asked the IMF for a financial agreement worth up to $10 billion. Several months and 20 meetings later, there is no progress towards a deal because Lebanon is still negotiating with itself. The Cabinet and the Parliament are bickering about the size of the financial sector's losses. In an economic plan released in April, the government estimated a net loss of £154 trillion between the BDL and commercial banks. The plan optimistically envisions an exchange rate of £3,500 to the dollar. That was the starting point for talks with the IMF, but the country's bankers are furious about the government plan, which would clean up balance sheets by wiping out shareholders and the largest depositors. They released their own accounting that estimates losses at less than half the official figure, largely thanks to an even more unrealistic estimate of Lebanon's future exchange rate. "It's the same kind of financial wizardry that got us into this mess," says Henri Chaoul, a former financial advisor to the government. Mr. Chaoul resigned in June in protest over the impasse. The IMF is still talking with the Cabinet. They held a meeting on July 10th focused on the electricity sector, but the fund has warned that negotiations can progress only if Lebanon agrees on one set of numbers, or if the Cabinet pushes through a few meaningful reforms as a show of good faith. Neither has happened. "It's criminal," says Alain Bifani, a former Director General of the Finance Ministry, who also quit his job in protest. Add to this, now, the devastation of the Lebanese capital. Damage at the port alone will cost hundreds of millions of dollars to fix. Among the buildings destroyed was Lebanon's main grain silo, leaving the country with less than a month's supply of wheat. Homeowners wonder how they will find the cash to pay for new glass or for aluminium window frames. Business owners, barely eking out a profit before the disaster, say they will call it quits rather than rebuild. The government pledged to investigate and to find the culprits within 5 days, enough time to name a scapegoat, but not to conduct a serious inquiry. There is rage in the streets, but also resignation. Lebanon has endured much in its modern history: a civil war from 1975 to 1990, occupations by Israel and Syria, a ruinous war with Israel in 2006, and myriad other conflicts and attacks. The Lebanese prided themselves on their ability to pick themselves up and rebuild their society. This moment feels different. The economic model has failed. So too the power-sharing system that kept the peace between the country's religions after the Civil War. As the country sinks, its venal political class seems oblivious. Gone is the optimism of October, when hundreds of thousands of Lebanese took to the streets to demand the overthrow of an entrenched regime. Now their thoughts are turning increasingly to emigration.
And finally, Mao's birthplace now makes raucous quiz shows.
Among this summer's television hits in China has been Sisters Who Make Waves. The show involves 30 female celebrities over the age of 30 competing for a spot in a 5-member band. Viewers watch them train, perform and live together. 500 women, picked at random, get to vote for their favourite. Within 3 days of its airing in June, over 300 million had watched the first episode on Mango TV, a streaming app owned by the state television network of Hunan, a central province. Social media sites brim with praise from young feminists for these somewhat older role models. At last, a break from the devoted mothers and dewy-faced ingenues beloved of official broadcasters. Making waves is what Hunan Broadcasting System, or HBS, does best. It is the most watched television network after China's Central Television, or CCTV, the state broadcaster, and occasionally surpasses its ratings. That is striking for an outfit run by the government of a province that is better known as China's largest producer of rice and the birthplace of Mao Zedong. Red tourism centred on Mao's formative haunts draws devotees of the chairman from around the country. But Changsha, the provincial capital, has become a font of China's popular culture. It is home to over 12,000 companies involved in creating it. They employ 1 in 8 of the city's workers. By one official calculation, no other sector contributes more to Changsha's wealth. In 2017, the most recent year for which figures are available, creative and cultural industries generated 9% of the city's GDP, a proportion twice as high as their contribution to national output. At their heart in Hunan is a broadcaster with a knack for cranking out programmes that are watched throughout China. In 2018, HBS's affiliates produced 6 of China's best-liked costume dramas and 8 of its most popular songs. Changsha's standing has turned its biennial Golden Eagle Awards into one of China's 3 most prestigious prize-giving ceremonies for TV stars. By GDP per person, Hunan ranks 16th among China's 31 provincial-level regions. But its 67 million people are the country's 5th biggest spenders on culture, education and entertainment. Hunan's journey to national pop culture prominence began in the 1990s, when the provincial broadcasting authorities created a satellite TV station with licence to try something new. It produced lively news reports, a celebrity-led variety show called Happy Camp, and even a matchmaking programme. By 2000, hotels in Beijing were luring guests with placards boasting, "We have Hunan Satellite TV," the New York Times observed at the time. Much of that early success was the work of a Hunanese bureaucrat, Wei Wunbin. When he took over as director of the Hunan Radio and Television Department, Mr. Wei read up about America's entertainment industry. On land once used by a state-run rose farm, he built a vast park for television and film production and moved the new satellite TV station there. The area, Malanshan, has since grown into a cultural powerhouse, drawing media giants such as iQIYI and Tencent. In 2017, 8 of the 10 most streamed variety shows on the Chinese internet were hatched there. Hunan TV was the first network in China to try broadcasting for profit. That led it to focus on entertainment, a priority which helped it avoid political mistakes, as Wu Changchang of East China Normal University has noted. According to Mr. Wu, Hunan TV struck a delicate balance between winning the love of viewers and approval from the Communist Party, which is a prerequisite of commercial success in China. The government has occasionally winced. In 2011, it took Happy Girls, a fantastically popular singing contest, off air. The official explanation was that the show was too racy for its prime-time slot, but many wondered whether its huge, excitable fan base worried the party. In 2004, a forerunner of the show, Supergirls, had let spectators vote for contestants by text message, a first in China. That smacked too much of democracy for the government. After a few years, Hunan TV limited voting mainly to a studio audience. These days, the network strives even harder to please the party. In 2017, it launched a series about ideology called Socialism is Kind of Cool. It included a quiz show on the life and works of Xi Jinping, China's leader. Yet Hunan stations still have political space to explore new things. in the view of a manager at Mango TV. The government wants to get closer to its audience, he says, in particular to the young who spend hours glued to their smartphones. Internet broadcasters such as Mango TV, with 18 million subscribers, help it to do so. Hunan TV's ability to experiment matters for the development of Chinese broadcasting. Li Shuan, a former presenter at the station, says the province is a training ground for much of the country's television talent. Industry insiders call Changsha the West Point of China's cultural entertainment industry, a reference to the American Army's elite academy. It is just as competitive. In 2013, Ms. Li was one of only 2 students from Hunan University who were admitted to Hunan TV's graduate programme. This year, some 30,000 people applied for 100 spots on Mango TV's trainee scheme. Mango TV encourages young recruits to speak up and suggest fresh ideas. They can receive funding to implement their proposals. Yang Tianhao, a co-founder of Urka Media, which manages 600 social media influencers from its offices in China, including Changsha and Los Angeles, says that young people in Hunan's capital are risk-takers, with parents who are more willing to let their children try their luck in a fickle industry than counterparts in richer Chinese cities. Well before Hunan's sisters filled smartphone screens, a Hunanese woman was making them. Zhou Chunfei, the founder of Lens Technology. Born to a poor rural family, she was named the world's richest self-made woman in 2018. People in China like to point to character traits which they believe are shared by natives of a particular province. The executive at Mango TV detects a cultural gene to break the rules among Hunanese. For evidence, he points to Mao and Liu Shaoqi, who was born in Changsha and served as Mao's prime minister. Hunan's broadcasters certainly have an interest in cultivating the stereotype. An edgy feel is crucial to the success of their brand.
Thank you for listening to Editor's Picks. For more from The Economist, subscribe at economist.com/podcast offer. I'm Fiammetta Rocco, and in London, this is The Economist.